Ah, yes, friends. On a Wednesday, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know who we are. It's going to be me, Adam Armbrecht, over here covering the New York Football Giants and also covering the Brooklyn Nets over on the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy Doug Norrie, joined as always by the healthy, wealthy, and wise season generational ticket holder for Big Blue, Mr. Andrew Makowitz, just clearing a little frog in his throat before we got underway.
Oh, I'm still coming off of sickness. It's like, when you have a kid in daycare, Adam, it forever. There will just be a cough in the house until allergy season goes away. But I'm here. I'm toughing it out because we got to give the OGP listeners what they want.
Gosh, good for you, you little trooper. You. By the way, I received a nice compliment for the hairdo yesterday over on the YouTube channel. I don't know if it was the bouffant or the pompadour. It was something though. It was very classy. It harkened back, I think, to the 50s, and it was lovely. So it's not quite there the same way now, but we're working on some things here. There's a chance that one day you walk in and we do alternate version of the theme music. It's doo-wop style, and I just come in kind of crooning my way through some of the conversation, which I think is exciting.
Adam, the thing that I appreciate most about it is last week people were worried if you had enough energy. Now they're talking about complimenting your hairstyle. So I think we've really turned a corner here.
I also like that I'm using my alternate mic right now. Yeah, it's good. I always like to, people question if I'm okay. I go 1,000 miles an hour in the other direction. I'm using an alternate mic, and I just think that the perceptual distance that's being created between me and the microphone, this is all for YouTube. We don't need to get too much into the details. The bottom line is, friends, we've been talking all off season now about these different positions, fleshing out who's going to make it, who could be a potential upstart, right? And see what happens on the back end for the New York Football Giants in terms of you brought in 11 players through the draft. You also went into undrafted free agency. There's a lot of names that we know about, but we're not sure what they're going to look like as we head into this 2022-2023 season. And interestingly enough, Andy, as today is going to be focusing on the defensive front, starting right up there in the trenches, there are guys we 100% know are going to be a part of this team in Leonard Williams and in Dexter Lawrence. And yet, I think expectations for Leonard Williams looks a lot different maybe now. And then also role for Dexter Lawrence could look potentially a lot different as well. Let's start with Leonard Williams here, because I think he's a very intriguing one from what he's been paid, where he's been over these last handful of regimes, and how maybe, this could be a nice opportunity for him to kind of push the reset button on what he wants to accomplish for Big Blue.
Yeah, I mean, look, he is the cornerstone guy. He's the guy that's being paid the most amount of money on the roster. He is expected to perform, and he has. I mean, look, 2 years ago, 13 sacks right before he got the big contract from the Giants, was playing on the franchise tag, and he proved that he was worth every penny of it by coming out, showing up, and getting pressure on a team that really didn't have that much going on in terms of wins and losses. He was still proving himself. Sure. Last year, tough year for the Giants. They were always playing from behind. When that's the case, it's just harder for him to put up some of the different metrics that we expect in terms of pressures, pass rushes and sacks. Still managed to get 8 sacks and was a force of nature. I expect to see more of 2020 Leonard Williams than I expect to see 2021. Is that where you're feeling this is going to go?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, and I thought about this when we were setting up the conversation. Remember, the Giants switched over in 2018 to the 3-4. And this is the first year when you look at we're going to get to on the edge, right? And you say, oh, there's high level talents that's going to be playing in and around this defensive front. And I think while your first instinct is to say in the 3-4, listen, you want those front three to be controlling and occupying that line there for the opposing offense, so that your edge rush can get there, so that you can bring pressure up the gut with the linebackers. But there is this tandem benefit here now. When you talk about Thibodeaux and you talk about Aeez Ojulari, I think Leonard Williams, you have to start to say, yes, we obviously know what you can do against the run. You've been very successful stopping that and playing effective, kind of doing that controlling the line of scrimmage, right? Fighting off with a hand bar and moving down the line to make sure that a running back isn't getting fully out to the edge and letting your defensive help get there. Now I think it has to shift a little bit. Where on a down-to-down basis, you expect Leonard Williams to, when Thibodeaux, when Aeez, when they are being occupied, when they're sending an extra blocker out to him, well, now Leonard Williams, you have to be able to go in, attack, and dominate a one-on-one matchup, potentially on the interior of the offensive line.
Yeah, and the thing about you just mentioned Aeez Ojulari, I think, when we talk about one of the edge rushers being on the outside, the Giants really haven't had a staunch edge rush across the board. Like to your point, when you're
First time
talking
ever.
about
Go back and think about it, man. This is when they brought in Martin from the Cardinals, right? When they first switched over to this, it was no names. It was no names running out there for 3 years on the outside edge.
Yeah, I mean Marcus Golden was there for a little bit and he proved to be able to like situationally be
Yeah.
okay. But then like our system changed and he was rendered useless, goes back to the Cardinals, has like 10 sacks. It's like great, clearly it's not him. But again, Leonard Williams was the focal point. And so like he's getting chip blocked, he's getting double covered, he's trying to do everything he can. The Giants are always playing from behind, so he's just doing everything he can inside. It feels like there are going to be maybe three, if not, I'm gonna say three guys that are gonna have double-digit sacks for the Giants this year, and I expect Leonard Williams to be one of them with the creativity of Wink Martindale's system. You look at someone like Aeez Ojulari that we mentioned before, had 10 sacks last year, will probably be in a similar fashion, and we obviously expect Keyvon Thibodeaux to be able to step up and be able to wreak havoc and get close to double-digit sacks early on. But I think having each of those edge rushers is going to definitely bolster the interior of the front of that offensive line. And like we said, I expect to see big things from Leonard Williams.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because before we get to, because we're going to cover even the depth pieces here. There's obviously a lot. There's a comical note that we're going to get to in a second. As I decided to go over, I said, why not CBS's depth chart right now? Because you can go anywhere you want on the internet and you can find 1,000 different versions of this depth chart, but it does match up in certain ways around a question that now I think Wink Martindale, and maybe it could be versatile. We know multiple looks playing players in different positions, but it certainly could bring up an interesting conversation. But to your point about having multiple three guys in double-digit sack numbers here for Leonard Williams, not only can you benefit from who's coming off the edge for you, but potentially you can look on the inside and say, well, what if it's going to be Dexter Lawrence next to you, right? Because when we talk about where Dexter Lawrence started to where he was utilized over last season and now coming back in under Wink, does it just seem like, and we've seen this from people in the comments too, does Dexter Lawrence as nose tackle just seem like the obvious move inside of Wink Martindale's system? To say nothing of what he can do if you put him on the outside in the 3-4, but think about sticking him next to Leonard Williams and saying, maybe I'll take on the double team and you can go ahead and be that much more effective.
Well, yeah, that's a great point, Adam, and this is the key to figure out the actual depth chart. As you mentioned, you go to three different websites, you'll get three different results, and it all starts with whether or not Dexter Lawrence is going to play nose tackle. He can play all along the interior. He's been on the outside. They've moved him inside. They've kind of just moved him around. I would argue that they've mismanaged him a little bit in terms of what he's capable of, but choosing where Dexter.
Just quick on that though, like I disagree on that in the sense of like, because the one thing I'll say is like I know again, it's easy to look at the past coaching staffs and say, God, what a disaster they've been. And we know that it wasn't great under them. But from a Dexter Lawrence standpoint, like I do think we talked about him over his first couple of years saying, well, if he doesn't have the build of a traditional nose tackle, it doesn't mean he doesn't have like the build of a modern day nose tackle, right? And sometimes I looked at it as just, well, there's a lack of bodies here on this team. So you want to have your best players on the field as often as possible. And over the last couple of years, you'd say, well, if you took Dexter Lawrence and put him in nose tackle, who was replacing him, right? The Giants just didn't have someone to put out there. And that's my only point to be, I don't give Dexter Lawrence any wiggle room here. He was a first-round draft pick. I don't care if you're moving him around a little bit. He needs to be effective wherever you line him up.
Look, I like to make excuses for Giants. That's what I like to do. So I don't know what to tell you,
It's fair.
Adam. But listen,
I don't know what to tell you. I like to make excuses.
Pick a situation that you think Dexter Lawrence will flourish in and make it happen. Stop
Yeah.
moving him all around. Give him one particular job. But I do think it's interesting. The Giants brought in a couple of different pieces to figure out based on where they want to put Dexter Lawrence. I actually think putting him at nose tackle will probably make the most sense, in this scheme. And the reason why is because I think the Giants have more players that can play that other position along the defensive front, and you can get a little bit more creative with the types of lineups that you end up putting in. Because right now, if you don't put Dexter Lawrence at the nose tackle, then clearly the nose tackle position is earmarked for Justin Ellis. He's been brought in from Baltimore, played under Wink Martindale's system previously. So he's been there before. You know, he's 31 years old. He's a little bit of a veteran. You kind of know what you're going to get. But he's kind of had limited snaps, right? Like he's had 25 or 30 total tackles over the last 3 years. So he's not a guy that's a veteran that's been around the block forever playing consistently. He's kind of been a rotational piece that Wink brought in. So having him start, it makes more sense to put Dexter Lawrence in that starting position. Then that opens up that other defensive end, defensive interior side to many other players, one being Jihad Ward. There's a few other guys that potentially could fit the bill there in terms of like Jalen Holmes, who they've picked up, who was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings out of Ohio State. It just gives you way more flexibility if you decide Dexter Lawrence is going to play nose tackle, and then you have a whole host of other edge guys that fit the bill a little bit better on the other side.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, listen, don't forget, right? DJ Davidson, I think, is a player that, regardless kind of what direction you choose to go to, and to your point, if you want to say that Justin Ellis is going to get the nod at the nose tackle position to start the season and Davidson's going to be behind him, and it's just a matter of who could overtake who there, that's certainly a viable possibility. On some depth charts, David Moa is getting kicked inside to that nose tackle position. We know we still have Nico Lelos, who for some reason feels like he's a 43-year-old NFL player, but he's a young talent as well. And just from a depth piece perspective, right? But the name that you mentioned, so first off, from a nose tackle perspective, I would put Dexter Lawrence in the middle of it because it solves a problem. You don't have someone that is elite, close to being elite, or maybe someone that, you know, midway through the season could be an elite player. I like having Davidson, and I would like the combination of saying it's Dexter Lawrence. Yes, Justin Ellis is here, but I'd like to see Davidson develop and be someone that starts to rotate in there. And then when you talk about on the outside, whatever Nico Lelos is or isn't, and I'm talking about him from a depth perspective, to your point, if you go with Lawrence at the nose tackle, then Jihad Ward, who's been mentioned as an edge rusher potentially, sometimes he gets mentioned as being down there on the defensive line. You can put him out there at the left defensive end to start, have Lelos behind him. You have Moa, who maybe has a little bit of versatility, but the guy that you mentioned in Jalen Holmes, I think is probably someone that's going a little bit overlooked here, at least from the standpoint of, you know, talking about depth. What are the expectations for this defensive unit when these guys need a breather? Because as much as anything, Leonard Williams can be really effective. Dexter Lawrence can be really effective. Let's just say Jihad Ward's the other guy, and he's super effective. Who comes next? Because these guys are not going to play, at least in theory, 95% of the snaps, especially in Wink Martindale's system. Jalen Holmes, when he came out, I mean, 6'5", 283, he came out as a prospect, he said, drafted by the Vikings, will eventually be an average starter with his 6.2 grade. To me, what that tells you is he can be a plus depth piece for the New York Football Giants, right? I think he has the right measurables and the right skill set to be versatile. Coming out of college, they said he's a little bit too light to be on the defensive line, little bit too stiff to be standing up. But in his time since then, he's developed, put on a little bit of weight, as almost every single NFL prospect does. And from that standpoint, like, I look at him as arguably being potentially one of the better depth pieces on that defensive front that we've had in a while, right? Like, I don't name the last time, and I know they have Ryder Anderson they brought in as well. We know Jabari Ellis is also going to be in the mix here on that defensive front. But Jalen Holmes is like an intriguing, still young, can still be effective, and sometimes it can just be the product of the defensive coordinator and saying, I bet that this guy looks as good as he's ever looked in these next couple of years when he's underneath a guy like Wink.
So when we're talking about some of these guys, the names might not be familiar because they just got brought in, short-term deals, but have familiarity with Wink or have been in the league a couple of different years. What I like to do is, and you know,
competition versus like actual prospect of being a part of the team.
Right. Well, but what I like to do in situations like this, where I'm trying to read the tea leaves at him, and I say this all the time, is follow the money. Follow the money, right? And so I always go back to the cap and the contracts of each of these players, because it's in camp, you're always going to hear the coaches talk up all these players. That guy's amazing. He's awesome. But when it comes down to it, brass tacks, it's like, okay, well, if it's close, who has guaranteed money and who doesn't, right? Like that is a key indicator of who will potentially be on the roster, because the tie goes to the one that has more money tied up in terms of the contract, right? Like, you're going to keep him. And what I find interesting about all this is Justin Ellis and Jihad Ward have the exact same cap number, and they're both guaranteed 300 grand would be in dead cap, and it would be about 750 grand in cap savings if you were to release them. Nothing too crazy. Jalen Holmes has zero guaranteed money. So when you think about that, it shows me that Justin Ellis and Jihad Ward have a better opportunity to make this roster just because they've invested money and dollars in them already. Whereas Jalen Holmes, you can cut bait clean if things don't work out, and it's $0 against the cap. And we know that the cap is something that Joe Schoen is still working on to this day.
Oh, 100%. And then we're going to turn our attention here into the edge rushing group. And I think you're right. And the difference being is you're going to give, or you'd like to think, you're going to give guaranteed money to veteran players that you think, hey, there's a floor here, right? Holmes, you're taking a little bit more of a flyer on. What could he be? But because he's younger, you can see a little bit more of that potential, being there. So when you look inside this room now, Jihad Ward, maybe he is going to be slated as a starter. But when you look over what could happen over the course of this summer, I would say, maybe a player like, and I don't know, maybe this is something we said we weren't going to get into yet. We're talking about like guys that could make the roster. Maybe I look at Holmes just when you look at the depth and say, I think that you'd like to keep him plugged in here on this team from a depth piece standpoint. Maybe he's further down than I realized, and the money is obviously a factor there. We'll see how it plays out. It's an evolving position. We talked about you can't solve every single need that you had on the roster. The Giants didn't do anything. They brought in Davidson obviously an undrafted free agency, but beyond that, this is still one of those spots that needs more depth and needs more talent, and it's not going to happen overnight there. But outside on the edge, my friend, where all of the sudden, thanks to the previous regime and thanks to the incoming Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll and Wink Martindale, we now have definitively, unquestionably, the best edge rushing group at a starter level that we've had since switching over to the 3-4, obviously with Keyvon Thibodeaux coming in this year and then having Aeez Ojulari coming over from last season, obviously drafted there, had a great end of his rookie campaign. Already talked about how he'd be excited to have Keyvon Thibodeaux break his Giants rookie record that he just set with sacks last season. Before we get into the depth pieces, we said about Leonard Williams and the value. This is where it comes from. Both of these players, obviously Thibodeaux on paper is the more dynamic and going to require more attention from opposing offenses. But Aeez Ojulari has already proven I can get this job done even when I don't necessarily have all the other pieces around him. It feels like there is going to be this great tandem feast process here, and then it can also funnel some opportunities into the middle for the guys we mentioned like Dexter and Leonard.
Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to say about this, and I was thinking about this for a while.
Goose.
There are more talented outside linebacking edge rushing duos in the league. Like I just think off the top of my head, someone like the Los Angeles Chargers who acquired Khalil Mack and have Bosa on the outside. Like those two are clearly more established. They're going to give, offensive coordinators nightmares. But when you think about the future and how bright it is, I would argue that the Giants might have the brightest future in terms of two guys coming off the edge in Aeez Ojulari and Keyvon Thibodeaux. You have Aeez Ojulari, who had double-digit sacks in his rookie season. The only reason he got drafted in the second round was because of all the injury concerns. He put those to bed, and he performed at the level everyone thought he could. And then you have Thibodeaux, who's larger than life, is a guy that is explosive and get towards the quarterback. Adam, I would argue that those two cornerstones is better than any future projections that anyone else might have all coming off the edge in the entire league.
Yeah, no, Aeez Ojulari is getting listed as breakout candidate around the league, right? In his second year. Obviously, we know the expectations for Thibodeaux. If he gets his nose into the playbook and processes it properly, you're right. It'd be interesting to stack up, right? 2 years from now, who has one of the the better tandems on the edge when you look across the league, and the Giants certainly have every opportunity to do that. Do you believe now when you said multiple, 3 players could have double-digit sacks, is it just the obvious of it's Thibodeaux, it's Aeez, and it's Leonard Williams, or do you look at it as can Dexter Lawrence be the byproduct of that? Or let's stay in this edge rushing room. How effective do you think not only Aeez can be now with Thibodeaux across from him, but how effective can Thibodeaux be impacting the game in multiple ways, right? Obviously, coming off the edge there and forcing, like the way that I keep looking at this is if you have Aeez Ojulari and Thibodeaux running wide on the edges, well, there you go, right? Pull those bookend tackles away and now leave that defensive front to be playing man-to-man and see who can hold up better, right? There's going to be a lot of plus matchups on the interior. But because Aeez is maybe a little bit more that upper body strength, you're going to want to push some of those bull rushes in. the different ways in which you're going to be able to manipulate the defensive front to bring some of those stunts and blitzes just feels like it feels like it's built for Wink Martindale, right? To be able to have a little bit of a field day here, giving some different looks to the opposing quarterback, which they haven't been able to do. Like, again, regardless of Wink, they hadn't had the bodies. Like, it doesn't look dynamic when you only have a collection of relatively stiff or relative, a step slow off the edge, all those types of moves that you want to accomplish that you just can't because you don't have the personnel.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question, Adam, yes, I'm stating the obvious. I look at Aeez Ojulari and Leonard Williams as two guys that you can expect or hope to get close to, if not over, double-digit sacks. And the reason why is simple. Leonard Williams has already done it in his career. He had 13 2 years ago, 8 last year. Aeez Ojulari had 10 last year. They both have already proven that they've gotten over double digits, right? So
Yeah.
that to me is clear. You draft an edge rusher like Keyvon Thibodeaux in the top 5 for a reason, because he is explosive and can get to the quarterback. It will be a disappointment if Keyvon Thibodeaux doesn't have at least 7 sacks.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, like, what's the bar, right? Yes, the standard of what needs to happen here. Like, regardless of, and it can't be the Leonard Williams thing, right? Well, he's not getting sacks, but this is the benefit off of it. It needs to be, no, Thibodeaux is both benefiting for other people and also getting his own, right?
Right, exactly. And so while in Wink Martindale's system, he likes to get creative with blitz schemes, and he likes to have different types of players be able to come off the edge. Maybe it's a cornerback, maybe it's a safety come in. Generally speaking, some of those front guys and those edge rushers are still putting up good numbers in his system. So those three right away, I think, are going to benefit the most in terms of production that you'll see on the stat sheet. I think moving Dexter Lawrence to the nose tackle position, you're probably going to see the same types of stats. I expect him to have, anywhere between 4 and 6 sacks, something like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, just
But the
think
stuffs, the
about.
solo tackles, right? The assisted tackles, that's where you want to see Dexter start to have his bread and butter, right?
Right. Well, and so think about 2 years ago. You just mentioned we haven't had this in years. I just keep going back to this. 2 years ago, going into the season, our edge rushers were Lorenzo Carter and Kyler Fackrell, right? Those were our edge rushers coming off the edge trying to wreak havoc against quarterbacks. Fast forward 2 years later, we have Aeez Ojulari and Keyvon Thibodeaux. Like, to me, it's not even that we improved; it's we've improved by miles in terms of what we have. And to that point, Oshane Ximines was at that point being a piece that we thought was going to be a starter, was going to flash. Now he's starting to move down the depth chart with guys like Quincy Roche who are here. And what that means is that, like, guys that we thought had to start and contribute can now play rotational, situational roles for the Giants, which I think is the most important piece of all of this.
Well, that was like coming out of 2018, like we were saying, right? You had the BJ Hills, the Dalvin Tomlinsons, and where they were getting used. Now that's a little bit of nose tackle value there. But then BJ Goodson, Alec Ogletree, right? Kareem Martin, Olivier Vernon, when it wasn't working out the way it had in Miami. Like, these are all the names that were getting thrown around there. And when you're trying to have success on the defensive side of the ball in a particular scheme, and you look at those names, this is why this is another failing, but it doesn't matter. Forward thinking. It's like you finally put some of the key players in the key positions you need to have success in this scheme, as opposed to somehow trying to reverse engineer that. And when you talk about depth, specifically now at this edge rusher position, this is where I think it is interesting. So already you're hearing some positive things about Quincy Roche and what he's done in camp. He's listed, I think you're going to see him listed as the second on the depth chart behind Thibodeaux. The other side then is obviously going to be potentially for Oshane Ximines to still hold on to. I tend to want to see somebody else overtake that just because, it's the final year for him. When you look at the depth side of it, this is still the intrigue. I'm going to say we're still in the phase of intrigue here. You have Elerson Smith, obviously rookie season gets derailed by injury. He's getting himself back into camp. But when you look at it right now on the strong side and weak side linebacker spot, it's Elerson Smith, Fox, Cam Brown. Like, those are the guys getting listed in that group. When you get past Roche and Ximines, what do you need to see from? I think this is worth asking. What do you need to see from Ximines to say, hey, you know what? Like, you can at least be the stopgap for us this year, as opposed to maybe week 3 or 4 going, and this is why there's a problem, because we don't have the healthy depth to give our guys a few breathers here. And that's where you see, some of those losses of having that 7 to 10 point lead and not being able to shut down the opposition.
So I'm gonna put a couple of guys in a bucket, Adam, because I think there's a few guys that we could talk about in the same breath and figure out how they fit on this roster. And you mentioned Oshane Ximines as one of them. I think when the other name mentioned was Cam Brown, and the last one is Elerson Smith.
Yep.
Those three, to me, it feels like there's going to be some musical chairs, and one of them is not going to have a seat when the music stops in terms of where this roster construction is going to go.
Sure.
Here's what I'll say. Oshane Ximines has been a disappointment so far in his career for the Giants. I think any Giant fan that looks at reality would agree with that statement. The challenge that we have is that someone like Cam Brown has never really gotten an opportunity to flash in anything other than special teams, but he does have special teams value. Having that ability to be able to get out there, I think he made 9 tackles on special teams last year.
Mhm.
He contributes in other areas as well as being a depth piece. I'm curious to see if Wink Martindale, he's got good size too, Adam. That's what I always thought about Cam Brown. He's
Oh yeah, we
6'5".
like his length. Yeah, it was the length. He had all the. I mean, again, it's like when you think, what do you like about Thibodeaux? You go, well, Cam Brown has a lot of that, just from the measurable standpoint, not about the talent or execution.
Right. Like he's 6'5", 223. Like when I think about a guy coming off the edge, 6'5", 220 seems like a pretty good number. He's rangy. He's athletic. He feels like he should be able to carve out a role in this defense. I know that the previous regime kept him a lot basically on special teams, didn't trust him to come in and contribute on the defensive side. But I actually think there may be a role for Cam Brown, just knowing how, the defensive scheme is going to change a little bit under Wink. I could see a world where he ends up keeping on the roster because he's got more upside than Ximines has, based on Ximines being out there and not showing as much as we would hope he would.
Yeah, and it's gonna be interesting to see like across the roster because I think like Ximines being on this roster, he's obviously listen, has he been underwhelming so far? Yes, but at the very least, it's Cam Brown didn't overtake him, right? He didn't steal away anyone's reps here. And to your point, he's been good on special teams, and maybe he just needed, as at the time that he was drafted, they said he's more of a raw talent, and you're going to want to develop him along. So you could start to see that there. I think it depends on like the numbers game, right? When you start to get down to the 53-man roster and you say, well, Cam Brown, you're a special teams guy. You have this quality, and we feel good about Quincy Roche. We feel good about player X. And then we're actually, as we get into this linebacker room, I'll have a little carryover commentary too. That could determine if Oshane Ximines still has value, even in the short term for the Giants, of just saying, do we have enough bodies, right? If Cam Brown can step up a little bit, well, then it opens up a lot of different versions of this. Likewise, if we turn our attention over to the linebacking core, then go ahead. You have one more thought there?
I do have one more thought because before we leave this, there's a really big question. Elerson Smith seemed to be a steal in the draft last year because they talked about how he was this raw talent that maybe the coaches could get a bunch out of him. Yeah. Obviously, he was injured last year. We didn't get to see as much of him as we wanted to, Adam. The question I have for you is, who's more likely if one player is going to get cut from this roster? Would it be Ximines or Elerson Smith? Like, if there's only one roster spot for those two guys, do you lean on the idea that Ximines is an experienced guy who's had a bunch of reps and you feel confident that he's been underwhelming, but he at least knows what he's doing? Or do you lean on, we've seen what Oshane can be. I'd rather take what's behind door number 2 because Elerson Smith is younger, 6'6", 245, and is oozing with potential to be a backup or rotational edge rusher.
Yeah, I think so. It's what's interesting. My knee-jerk reaction is Elerson Smith has the better opportunity because, again, if you're the Giants now, the injury factor is real because they want reliability, consistency, right? You need to have the bodies out there to be able to play. But everything about Elerson Smith from a measurable standpoint seems to fit the Wink Martindale thing. Oddly enough, like Aeez Ojulari, this is the difference. When you're drafted high in the NFL draft, when you're a top prospect, whether or not you kind of fit the physical mold that a team wants to use you in or that a coordinator likes you in, kind of doesn't matter because your talent outweighs it. You're productive no matter what, right? And that's what Aeez, I think, becomes the outlier. Because when I look at Oshane Ximines, I go, or when you look at Lorenzo Carter, you go, kind of the same type of mold, right? Not necessarily the most flexible, not maybe not the most athletic guy. Yeah, but the power, the speed, the quickness, the football IQ, all of those things are what elevates Aeez Ojulari to being one of the better players in the NFL. Whereas with an Oshane Ximines, it's like, yep. And some of these limitations just push you into this weird area where you're never going to quite get there. Elerson Smith, like Cam Brown, is this untapped potential. I think what you need to see happen that allows and affords the Giants to say, well, because I think Elerson Smith might still be practice squad eligible too in his second year. So there's flexibility there. You need to see these young players step up over camp and say, I can be a depth piece. If you can prove that, then I want Cam Brown and I want Elerson Smith. And as we turn to the linebacker group, there's players there where you go, listen, you'll be contributing on special teams and you'll also be these depth pieces. I can jettison Oceanic Jimenez. And again, as we said before, the big factor being last year for Oceanic back on another contract. You need to have talent on the field, but the balancing act of what do we have in the young players? Because guess what? We're in year 2 and year 3 on these other guys. So we need to figure out if we're bringing them back on second contracts. We have a couple of years to do so. If you can't know by watching tape on X-Man what he is or is not, the science has to kind of be solved on him at this point.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel the same way about Elerson Smith, and I think just having that upside is important.
Now, here's the rollover that I wanted to say about when we start to look at plenty, I think, of competition when we get inside to this linebacker room. There's a lot of questions to be asked here, and I think they're all relatively positive, especially around some guys we talked about a little bit before already, like Tay Crowder. But one of the carryover players, and you could argue maybe two, we talk about deep dive here, but let's start at the top, and then I'll mention this carryover player that I think influences the decisions that you may make on the edge when it comes to a player like Oceanic Jimenez. Obviously, in the middle, it's Blake Martinez coming off of that injury. It's Tay Crowder alongside of him. And then really in behind them, at least as listed right now, whatever metric or depth chart you want to go by, we know that TJ Brunson, who missed all of last season due to injury, Mr. Irrelevant from 2 years ago. And then as it stands right now, you're in this, remember, Justin Hilliard also missed time. And then McFadden, who they drafted in to go along with Darion Beavers as well. Is this the most interesting position on the defensive side, just from the, well, where is Blake Martinez from a health standpoint? You know, is he going to fit totally inside of Wink Martindale's team? And then Tay Crowder, I think talented. And we talked before, like I can project him to have a different and impactful role for this team underneath Wink Martindale. But I don't know if the first thing I think about is inside linebacker next to Blake or whoever.
Well, so yes, I will agree that it's probably most interesting because there's question marks at both inside linebacking positions. Whereas, at safety, I think the safety position is fascinating, but we know Xavier McKinney is going to be one of them. It's just a matter of who's going to be playing alongside him. But you mentioned a couple of different things that bring up question marks. One is Blake Martinez coming off an injury, missed most of last year. And that injury impacts two people. It impacts Blake Martinez. Is he going to be healthy? He was he was having over 100 sacks every year. I think he had like 130 sacks consistently over the last 3 or 4 years. He was a stalwart at being able to find, seek, and destroy any runners that are coming through, through the front.
Yeah.
What happens is when Blake Martinez gets hurt, someone needs to step up. And admittedly, the depth at our linebacking position was always something that we pointed out as a question mark. It kind of thrust Tay Crowder into a situation where he had to perform more than I think what the team was expecting him to do, going into last season because of the injury. And I will say, I think it was a little bit of a mixed bag for Tay Crowder. Like he was there. He had a bunch of different tackles, had almost 90 tackles last year. Well, did an okay job. But I think, did that experience allow us to say he's definitely locked in as a starting linebacker in this league alongside Blake Martinez? Or did seeing so much of Tay Crowder turn out and say, okay, we kind of know what we got from him. Maybe Micah McFadden or Darion Beavers or one of these guys that we've brought in maybe has a little bit more of what we want. I'm just wondering from your perspective, do you think Tay Crowder did enough last year for you to sit here and say he deserves to start alongside Blake Martinez week 1 no matter what?
No, see, and here's what's hard about it too, because to your point, out of necessity, you started him. So I think this is one of those things where you go, like, unlike an Oceanic Jimenez, where it was like, listen, where you were drafted, you need to come in, you need to be a contributor early, develop, and then be ready to potentially be a starter. And that hasn't necessarily happened. It obviously hasn't happened that way, right? When it comes to Tay Crowder, to your point, it's like you get pushed into this starting role probably way sooner than you wanted to. You're transitioning from another position from college coming into the pros. And it's weird because when you go back and look at it, to your point, he played and started all 17 games for the Giants last year. Maybe the most concerning or the red flag for me based on what you would need him to do is he gave up 59 completions on 74 targets to the opposing quarterbacks, right? So almost 80% completion percentage inside of the Blake Martinez, Tay Crowder tandem. Tay Crowder needs to be the guy that's picking up a tight end in coverage, right? Or picking up the running back coming out of the backfield because you're not going to put that onto Blake Martinez. So that's one of the first problems. The rating for the QB also went up from his rookie year to his second season. So maybe a little bit of, overexposure from that standpoint. The positive side would be 130 combined tackles, had just 8 missed tackles and a sub 6% missed tackle rate. So like he proved himself to be consistent and reliable. This is where when we talk about role, and you mentioned some of these other players, like I think that Tay Crowder, and even saying in the secondary, when you talk about the safety position, like Tay Crowder for his measurables, I kind of like him more as the pseudo linebacker-ish safety that comes down into the box at times and can support in the run game, has a little bit more meat behind him, maybe can pick up a tight end, etc. So my ideal version, as we talk about this position, is that Tay Crowder becomes your number one depth piece at the position, at least that's what you prefer to see happen, or to see someone maybe start to eat into some of his reps. I don't think you want to see him by the end of this upcoming year saying Tay Crowder played and started all 17 games. Now, in theory, if he did it under Wink, you'd say he must have been having success. I think you want him closer to 50% of the reps as opposed to 100% of the reps, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think I have a sneaking suspicion if Tay Crowder is only playing 50% of the snaps at him, then in your ideal world, who is chewing up the other 50%? Is it one player in particular? Is it a group of players that you're hoping kind of rotate in there? Like, give me the idea of what the perfect situation is if Tay Crowder's taking half the reps.
Yeah, listen, from a Blake Martinez perspective, if McFadden, it's not a like for like, but I think we see him in that mold, the same type of ability, some of the same type of limitations. If Tay Crowder is going to get pulled away from the starting rotation and you're going to see reps going, it has to be Darion Beavers. And this is the player that I talked about from this holdover effect. When you give the measurables of Elerson Smith and of Cam Brown, guess what? Like, Darion Beavers has similar measurables to those players. Now, does he have the same strength and ability to execute off the edge as well? Maybe, maybe not. But the reason why I thought he was a steal in the draft and why he's a steal for the Giants, especially with when you look at their positions, Darion Beavers can, early in his career, start to take over some reps on the inside. If it works and it looks right, you can go ahead and plug him in. Don't look back, whether it's Blake Martinez or long-term McFadden. I think that you can plug him right in there. But his versatility is going to afford when you want to rotate in Tay Crowder and you maybe need to give a breather to Aeez Ojulari on the outside. I think that Darion Beavers is going to be capable of stepping over into that role. Doesn't mean he's going to be the best pure pass rusher, but athleticism and ability to cover, yeah, that's the kind of player you want there. And Wink Martindale begs for versatility in his system. And I think Beavers, along with Elerson Smith, along with maybe a Cam Brown, how he develops this offseason, these guys all fit the mold of guys that you could move around a little bit and say, hey, hold your own if you have to pick up the tight end. Hold your own if you have to support in the run game. Hold your own if you need to drop into zone coverage, right? Like, that's what you want to have. And my ideal is just Darion Beavers is starting week 1 alongside Blake Martinez, like done deal. And we move forward with that.
It's tough because I wonder.
Who else you want starting next to Blake Martinez?
Well, no, listen, I think the challenge that we have is if you start Blake Martinez, Darion Beavers alongside of him, the problem is neither of them is above average or really good in pass coverage, right? Like Darion Beavers is a big boy. He is 6'4".
He's closer to being to edge rushing as opposed to linebacker coverage. 100%.
Exactly. He's so big that he's so good at getting to the quarterback, but he's also good at stuffing the run because his sheer size makes him so strong and agile. The problem is if you pair him up with Blake Martinez in the middle, you're really giving up a lot of pass protection. So I do think situationally Beavers can play inside, but it has to be more predictable run plays rather than pass plays. To your point, you'd like to see someone in the mix there that maybe like in nickel packages can have a little bit more versatility. But I do think that Beavers will get his opportunity and will be a nice rotational piece there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about him. Maybe if we say, you want to see him to get whatever, say it's 40% of the reps early in his rookie year. Where do the 40% come from, right? Is he the rotational depth piece? When we talk about before, well, Ocean Ximenez, he's gone. Okay. Can you ask a Darion Beavers? Can you ask an Elerson Smith? Can these guys make up the difference in some of these depth areas that affords you to say we save a roster spot and we create a little bit more depth for ourselves? The other one that I think when you look at this too, like we mentioned McFadden, and we're not looking past him. We're going to talk about him a lot. I just think that the skill set is kind of known there in a very positive way. Like I have no problem saying that slowly Blake Martinez doesn't look so good, or he has a couple little nagging injuries, and you're just like, yeah, we just slid a little McFadden in there, and we feel, we feel fine about that. The other guy was TJ Brunson, though, Mr. Irrelevant. Like, I'm not trying to overstate anything, but do you think that he still has a role on this team? He missed all of last year, obviously with the injury. It's weird, man. Like I almost, of all the guys that are holdovers here, to say nothing of Carter Coughlin, but TJ Brunson is very intriguing to me. Like I think that he is a young prospect that, again, because of injury, out of sight, out of mind. But remember, like he showed a lot of value in his rookie year as a back end Mr. Irrelevant draft pick. Does he have a chance to kind of be something under Wink Martindale in your eyes?
I do, and the reason why is because everyone needs to fit a role, and what I mean by that is Darion Beavers fits a perfect role for Wink Martindale because he has versatility. He can spell Keyvon Thibodeaux on the outside in certain situations. He can spell Tay Crowder or Blake Martinez on the inside, depending on what scheme you want to give. He gives that versatility in terms of if you want to bring him in pressure, like he is a guy that can either stand up or he can come in the run block. I think TJ Brunson has an interesting dynamic where he can carve himself out a role here. You mentioned he was injured. We didn't get to see as much of him, but I do feel like he has an opportunity to show up and show out here. You mentioned Micah McFadden. He is a guy that he's like a known commodity to me. And that's why we're probably not talking about him. It's like,
which seems almost like borderline absurd. Like he's a rookie. You know what I mean? We're like, we know what that guy can do. He can just replace Blake Martinez.
It's like you know that he's not the most athletic. He's not going to run the fastest 40 time, but he's going to try to get to the ball and make tackles. He's going to play hard. He's going to be inside. He may get bowled over from his size from bigger offensive linemen or bigger running backs, but you kind of know what you're getting from McFadden, and that's why we have him in that Blake Martinez like for like. He can spell Blake in periods. I think TJ Brunson's the most intriguing one because I think he has the ability to take snaps from Tay Crowder if he's healthy.
Yeah, and again, kind of building the same mold, right? A little bit leaner at the linebacker spot. You think about them maybe a little bit more in coverage opportunities, potentially, although Brunson showcased himself to be a guy that could really lay some wood in run support, at least going back to his rookie year. Then I'll ask you a question that hurts me. If you only have one spot on the roster, is it TJ Brunson or is it Carter Coughlin? Because he's kind of the guy we're not mentioning. I don't know if, again, he had injuries last year too. You like to reset the opportunity table for all of these guys. And yet, with the addition of McFadden, when you look inside the room, we know Fox is there as well. Carter Coughlin, key special teams contributor. As long as the roster spot is there, from a special team standpoint, I think Carter Coughlin automatically has a spot and then can still be a contributor and can continue to develop. I don't want to shortchange him. Like I love him as a prospect. And I just wonder, it's like, where's the better value going to be if you only came down to one spot for Wink?
Well, I'll take it a step further. Not only do I think TJ Brunson has a leg up on your boy Carter Coughlin, I'd say that Tom and Fox might even have
Hey, come on now.
I mean, Tom and Fox might have an inside track just knowing that he's been groomed by former Giant greats. He's a guy that the Giants have brought in the new regime and wants to take a look at him. He has a little bit more athleticism than I think Carter Coughlin does. Depending on the role that you need that backup linebacker to play, if Tom and Fox has the ability to play special teams, it's going to be tough sledding for Carter Coughlin to really make an impact and be able to make this roster.
Well, that's upsetting to me. I mean, you've driven it in a way that is painful. By the way,
that's a good thing. But that's a good thing because a year ago when Blake Martinez goes down, we're like, can Carter Coughlin be the starting inside linebacker for the Giants? You're like, no, he can't. No, he cannot. Like, stop it. Now we're asking, can he make the 53-man roster? That just shows how quickly the depth is being able to be built across this defensive front. This front seven has way more depth than it did 2 years ago. We mentioned on the outside what it looked like. Over the last couple of years, we're always saying who's going to be next to Martinez. At least we have some that I think are excited about Beavers. I think McFadden can have a role. We talked about TJ Brunson. It just feels like the tide is rising in terms of the type of talent that we have at all of these different positions.
Never forget, though, that Carter Coughlin was highly sought after by Ohio State when he was coming out of high school. He ended up playing at Minnesota, where his father was a defensive lineman and his grandfather was an MVP for that team going back to 1959. So he made a choice to go play at a place where he had family lineage. So and I only say it to bring up the point. All these guys fall into that category, right? Of young, talented players, a lot of back end of the draft, right? Opportunities for a lot of them. but some do come from a higher pedigree than others. I'm not going to sell my little gopher short just yet. There's still opportunities for him to make an impact on this team. We'll see how it plays out, man. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, as we like to say, this is one of those those positions and the defensive front, right? Every time, defensive line, edge rusher, linebacker. How many are we listing, right? Like we're listing so many curiosities. Who could be starting next to Blake Martinez? Even if Blake Martinez is healthy and starting, we know he's not the long-term answer. So what do you want to see when he needs a breather? Someone else coming along there, right? Where's the depth going to be behind Thibodeaux and behind Aeez Ojulari? What's going to happen with Dexter Lawrence? And even if he does play nose tackle, then is Jihad Ward good enough on the outside? Who spells them, right? So there's a lot of this turnover that's coming here. And I think if you want to start to get optimistic about the season prospects for the Giants, it starts with probably some blend of, as much as you and I think, love the young talent, some blend of experience and quantifiable, known things you can put on the field, and then exciting dynamic playmakers that they've brought in this first year underneath Joe Schoen, right? It's going to be interesting. And this offseason is going to tell us a lot about what to expect from this defense.
The simple thing that I'll say is usually when you're asking these questions of like who's going to start, you don't have competent players or enough superstars or really good players, and so that's what creates question marks. But I think this is a good thing for the Giants because under Wink Martindale, he likes to get creative with how he brings blitzes. And if we're saying that there's versatility across a lot of these different positions, and there's 2 or 3 or even 4 guys off the edge that can spell Keyvon Thibodeaux or Aeez Ojulari, that's a good thing because it allows more flexibility and creativity when we think about how can we get to the quarterback. And so ultimately, these are good questions to have because the Giants have more talent than they've had in years on the defensive front.
Fascinating to see. It just popped into my head. What could become of when you start to say, well, there's 6 guys that are all getting 23% of the reps, right? To your point of like under Wink Martindale, it's like, well, I need to take Crowder for a couple. And then, yeah, and you know what? And then Brunson for, I'm not giving predictions about this, but like, oh, it's Tay Crowder and TJ Brunson for a rep in the middle of the linebacking core with other pieces because we just want to give our best chance to cover whoever it may be, right? Or we've talked about these safeties and, Dane Belton and what's going to happen there. All of a sudden you see a safety down in the linebacker spot. I think that's the biggest takeaway too, is we don't know. The only thing we know for sure is that Wink Martindale, we always talk about the versatility piece. And he's said this in interviews with Bob Papa since coming in. It's not only that the edge rushers get the pressure on the quarterback. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish that from the inside, from the outside, up the gut, from the linebacker spot, and from the secondary. So every one of these pieces, I think there's probably going to be traits from some of these guys that by the end of the summer, we're going, oh, you know what? This is why Tay Crowder can be exponentially more valuable, right? This is why a Cam Brown is elevating himself while maybe Carter Coughlin gets a little bit lost in the shuffle. We'll have to wait and see, but it's an exciting time. If not, you can hear it in my voice. There's some sadness, right? Because there could be a world where I have to bid a fond farewell to players that I've really enjoyed, and that'll be painful. But at the end of the day, you can subscribe over on YouTube. You get the podcast. We appreciate all the support, the conversations, the interaction. This was a double dose episode. We'll come back in for Friday, and we're going to talk about a lot of these long shot guys. Who are the surprises that could come off of here? And we still have more positions to look at. What's going to happen at the back end of the wide receiver group? Do we expect anything exciting or interesting beyond Daniel Bellinger at tight end? So still a few more nooks and crannies to get into as OTAs about to wrap themselves up next week. We'll break that all down. You'll subscribe. You'll like it. We'll enjoy it. And as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and every single time, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.